One of the most urgent tasks for our country is to decisively defeat the climate hysteria hoax.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
That's right, Greta. It is Friday, and this is the best day of the week. Not just because the weekend is almost here, but because this is the day the Heartland Institute broadcasts the Climate Realism Show. My name is Jim Lakely. I'm Executive Vice President at the Heartland Institute, which is an organization that has been around for 41 years. As a matter of fact, today, this very day, we were founded 41 years ago, and we are known over those decades as the leading global think tank pushing back on climate alarmism. Heartland and this show bring you the data, the science, the truth to counter the climate alarmist narrative you've been fed every single day of your life. There is nothing else quite like the Climate Realism Show streaming anywhere. So I hope you will bring friends to view this live stream every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And also like, share, and subscribe. And leave your comments underneath the video. These very easy actions help convince YouTube's very mysterious algorithm to smile upon this program. And that gets the show in front of even more people. And as a reminder, because big tech and the legacy media are not big fans of the way we cover climate and energy on this program, Heartland's YouTube channel has been demonetized. So if you want to support this program, and I really hope you do, please visit heartland.org/TCRS. That's heartland.org/TCRS. And you can join other friends of the program who give a tax-deductible donation to help bring this show to the world every single week. And before we get started, we want to thank our streaming partners, junkscience.com, CFACT, what's up with that? The CO2 Coalition, and our friends at Heartland UK Europe. Now let's get started. We have a great and big show today. And we have with us, as usual, Anthony Watts. He's Senior Fellow at the Heartland Institute and publisher of the world's most viewed website on climate change. What's up with that? We have Sterling Burnett, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who also serves as the director of the Arthur B. Robinson Center on Climate and Environmental Policy at the Heartland Institute. Unfortunately, Linnea Lukin could not be here today. She's traveling. She'll tell us more about that next week. And also, we have Andy Singer, our producer, behind the scenes, making sure everything flows great. And we are so happy, especially this week, to welcome back to the program Dr. Will Happer, PhD. He is Professor Emeritus of Physics at Princeton University. He's been an advisor to at least 2 U.S. presidents and recipients of many academic awards. And he was also a guest this week on the biggest and most influential podcast in the world, the Joe Rogan Experience. We're here to talk about that experience, Will. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Jim, and happy birthday to the Heartland Institute.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that a lot. Okay, so let's get the whole panel up here, Andy. We're going to start, as we always do this program, with the crazy climate news of the week. Hit it, Andy. Thank you, Bill Nye. Well, usually we have a handful of different items for this segment, but this is a very special episode. So the craziest climate news of the week is that Joe Rogan had 2 of the best climate scientists in the world on his program to debunk climate alarmism and to try to break people out of the climate cult. And Rogan was very open to what Will Happer and his friend and a friend of this program in the Heartland Institute, Dick Lindzen, had to say. We have a lot of clips from that fantastic, very influential interview that we're going to play. I checked last night. Andy could probably check it and pop it in the private chat on how many views that video already has on YouTube on Joe Rogan's channel. It was above 800,000 last night when I went to bed. But between that and Spotify is his actual, proprietary platform, is probably close to 2 million at least, and it's only been a few days. So congratulations on that. Will, and your friend Dick. But I wonder if we could start out before we start playing some clips and talking through that experience. If you can share with the audience a little bit what that experience was like. I know that he flew you and Dick out to his studio in Austin, and it seems on the podcast that everybody got along really well.
Well, it was a great experience. We went out to his studio, which was just southwest of Austin. And it's an amazing place, full of stuffed crocodiles and bears, various bizarre masks and things. On the other hand, Joe himself was as natural as they come, very straightforward. So it was a real pleasure to chat with him.
Yeah, go ahead, Sterling. Did you want to say something?
No.
Oh, you did? Okay, yeah. It seems to I've watched a lot of Joe Rogan's videos. I think he's not for everybody, but his audience is very different from this audience. It's very different from almost every audience. It's you had the opportunity, Will, to speak to a lot of people who have consumed nothing but mainstream media and have not really heard what's about climate science from a skeptical point of view instead of an indoctrinated ideological point of view. And it seems to me Rogan, no matter who he's interviewing, seems to have a very curious mind and is open to smart arguments and conversations. And I imagine you would agree with that.
Absolutely. Very few people can pull off a interview like that and keep the interest up. It's kind of a dull subject for lots of people. Who hated chemistry and algebra in high school, and here they're being lectured again by the same folks.
Maybe you could share with us too. How did it come about that you and Dick Lindzen were invited on Joe Rogan's podcast? I mean, this is the biggest get in media today. This is bigger than being interviewed by 60 Minutes, especially because of the new and younger audience that you were reaching. But how did this come about?
I'm really not sure, Jim, but in response to some of the solicitations for comments, on EPA endangerment finding, for example, Dick Lindzen and I, with help of an attorney friend, Chuck Weller, put together a legal brief, so to speak, and it was pretty hard-hitting, and it's possible that Joe was interested in that. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, well, he's had other climate scientists on. He has scientists from, various fields, astrophysicists, you name it, nutritionists. I mean, he's got a very wide-ranging interests, and he's so powerful. He just brings on people to talk that he would want us to talk to, finds interesting, about topics that he finds interesting. He has that kind of media power today, so that's really great to see. And what's interesting also is that I know he's had alarmist. I don't want to put labels like that on that necessarily. But let's just say scientists that look at the topics differently than you and Dick Lindzen do. He's had them on his podcast as well. So this is a great attempt at balance, and it seems his thinking on this has changed. So that's good. All right, let's get to some clips here that we can go through and share with the audience if they have not seen this episode of the Joe Rogan Experience featuring Will Happer and Dick Lindzen. Actually, yeah, I found it fun to listen. I mean, Joe Rogan and I are actually about the same age, and he shared his view with you to kind of get started about how Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth was full of lies, and that he remembered when he was a kid in the 70s that show In Search Of, when Leonard Nimoy told him and me and all of America that leading scientists were convinced of a coming ice age and that would be horrible, which it would be. Anyway, our friends and yours at the CO2 Coalition, Will Happer, as you're with that organization, they grabbed a little bit of that and put it up on Twitter for a clip. So let's play that clip, Ice Age, please, Andy.
Interesting. So Senator Gore has been involved in this whole climate thing for quite a long time then.
Oh, yes, very long
When
time.
he was a senator, before he was vice president.
That's right.
When I was a child, I do remember Leonard Nimoy had a television show called In Search Of. Remember that show?
Sure.
And on that show, he warned of an oncoming ice age.
Right.
Do you remember that? And I remember being a kid and freaking out like, oh my God, Spock is telling us the world's going to freeze. This is terrifying.
If we are unprepared for the next advance, the result could be hunger and death on a scale unprecedented in all of history.
What scientists are telling us now is that the threat of an ice age is not as remote as they once thought. During the lifetime of our grandchildren, Arctic cold and perpetual snow could turn most of the inhabitable portions of our planet into a polar desert.
And then somewhere along the line, it became global warming.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sure did. You know, in addition to that, the hockey team, which consists of people like, you know, Gavin Schmidt and Michael Mann and all those folks over there, they tried to get rid of the idea that science was telling us there was going to be a new ice age, you know, back then. They actually published a paper saying, oh, no, that's all wrong, and then gave a bunch of bullshit citations about it. I mean, if your science is that weak that something like that threatens you, you need to get out of the business.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point, Anthony. Because when people point out, and we point out, and others, you know, arguing about these things in the public on social media, they will mention that we were told an ice age was coming, and the alarmists and the media try to pretend it never happened. Well, there's a clip of it. Leonard Spock himself telling us that we're all in big trouble.
By the way, I've got a little trivia side note here. I actually did some work for that TV show In Search Of. When I was at Purdue University, one of the jobs that I had was technical on the tornado simulator, and they came to film it. And so I set up this city made out of styrofoam when we turned the tornado simulator on, and it destroyed the city, and that made it into the show. So just an FYI.
I was going to say that one of the most distinguished climate alarmist was Steve Schneider at Stanford, but in 1970 he was very much on the global cooling side, and he wrote quite a nice paper with a guy named Rasool, in which he pointed out that there's no way that CO2 could possibly save us from the coming ice age, because the CO2 absorption bands were saturated, and you know, if you do the calculation, you only get less than 1 degree of warming from doubling. Every bit of it was true. And then, you know, 10 years later, he switched sides and forgot about this paper. It was a good paper, still worth reading.
Well, he co-authored a book with John Holdren, Obama's science advisor, where they warned of the coming ice age. And I remember a later interview that Schneider did where he said, look, in the 70s, the data indicated that global cooling was happening, and I went with the data, and now it indicates the only data he was citing, of course, was temperature trends and climate models, projections, which isn't data. But he says, now the data says differently, and so I believe in global warming.
There you go. Yeah. Well, so Will, you and Dick Lindzen got to talk a little bit of science with Rogan. You know, I've actually talked to several people separately who loved the interview, and they said that you and Dick did a fantastic job explaining the science in ways that lay people can more easily understand. And in fact, we here have an example of that. Speaking of CO2, Andy, you want to play that clip, please?
We've set back the serious study of climate, I think, by 50 years by this manic focus on CO2. If your theory doesn't have CO2 in it, forget it. You know, you won't get funding. If you're willing to support the narrative, you will be handsomely rewarded, and you'll be elected to societies, you'll win prizes.
And you'll be shunned again if you don't.
That's right. So I think, for example, if some administration in Washington wants to slow this down and get some sanity, they should cut the funding, or they should at least open up the funding to alternate theories of what is controlling climate. Because the theory that the control knob is CO2 doesn't work. It's completely clear it doesn't work.
And it just seems so insane that if we move in the same direction, and we, as you say, if it really is holding back climate science by 50 years, that's a travesty.
Well, you know, Dick would have made a lot more progress, and his colleagues would have made a lot more progress if they hadn't been forced to deal with this CO2 cult.
Cult. I like that word.
Yeah.
Well, it was true what I said.
Yeah. Right. You know, I wondered, you know, when I listened to it, actually talking to some other friends about this interview, I went in not really knowing what to expect. I expected it to be great, but obviously I didn't know exactly what you're going to talk about. Joe Rogan tends to wander around and go where he wants, and you got to follow along with him. Because of the nature of this show, the Climate Realism Show, we talk about science and data quite a bit. We'll talk about published papers and articles, that get down into the nitty gritty. It's pretty much a niche kind of thing. Is there part of CO2's effect on the atmosphere or any other part of science that, looking back, you kind of wish you had a little bit more time or had an opportunity to get and talk to Rogan and his audience about?
Well, I thought it was best that we not get down into scientific details, that bores most people. And but if I had an ideal audience, like a captive, graduate course at Princeton, I would have been much more comfortable talking about the Schwarzschild equation and, quantization of the electromagnetic field. That turns me on a lot more than what we discussed with Rogan.
Understandable. But you were able to explain. I think either you or Dick did mention that the warming ability of carbon dioxide molecules in the atmosphere is diminishing the more you put into it, and also explained that we're around 400 parts, 430, who knows, parts per million, and how Dick talked about how the ice ages, and if we're down to 180 parts per million, we're in big trouble.
Well, there is pretty good evidence that there was plant dieback at high altitudes, like the Gobi Desert during the last glacial maximum. And so it was uncomfortably low CO2 levels then. It's a bigger problem the higher the altitude is, because if you're up at 10,000 feet, you've already lost a lot of CO2 because the pressure is lower. And you also lose water faster because it's easier to evaporate water at these lower pressures in windier conditions. So it's a real problem for high altitude plants first, but eventually it'll get them all if the CO2 level gets too low.
About 150 parts per million.
Yeah, 150 C3 plants really stop growing. C4 can continue to somewhat lower levels.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and one other part of the science of the atmosphere that you and Dick Lindzen were able to talk about, it seemed to really excite and exercise Joe Rogan, and that was a little discussion about methane and banning cows and all this stuff, because it's I just saw an article, 15 minutes before we came on the air, or I should say a video on X before we came on the air, about scientists complaining that methane is even worse than CO2. We got to get rid of the cows. So you guys did bring this up, and that's the kind of subject that his audience really wants to hear. So let's play that one, please, Andy.
But, everybody's under the gun.
But there were consequences in Ireland.
Yeah.
Yes.
They had to kill half their cattle.
Yeah, which is
nonsense.
Total nonsense and insane. And if you pay attention to what regenerative farmers will tell you, is that, like, if you do it correctly, it's actually carbon neutral.
At least carbon neutral.
Yeah. and possibly contribute. It's like the whole thing is nature. This is how it's all set up. Animals eat grass, they poop manure fertilizes the plants. It's all real simple. It's been around forever. And this idea that all of a sudden cow farts and burps are a giant issue and they're going to kill us all. We need to kill all the cows. Like, who are you? Like, who's saying this?
Well,
and how'd you get to talk? Like, how'd you get to kill half their cows? Like, you should go to jail.
They should go to jail.
You're so stupid. You're criminally stupid. You killed their cows.
But when it comes to attractive drugs, power is one of the worst.
It might be the worst.
Yeah,
it might be the worst. And if people can get people to do their bidding, they often love to do it. Even if it's preposterous, like getting you to kill half your cows so that you have a less high methane count you're releasing from your organization.
Methane and cows, the whole thing is moot.
maybe I can say just a word or two about it. It is true that each additional methane molecule in the atmosphere has about 30 times the effect of each additional CO2 molecule. So on a per molecule basis, at today's conditions, methane is 30 times more potent than CO2. But what they never tell you is that methane concentrations are hardly changing. So CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere 300 times faster than methane. So that means that CO2 is still 10 times more effective than methane, and its effects aren't very big either. So that it's just one piece of propaganda trickery after another with respect to methane, but methane is not a problem.
Gordon Tullock, who is a lawyer, an economist that worked with James Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner, he wrote a book a number of years ago that he's passed now. I forget whether the book was called Welfare for the Well-to-Do, but he talked about, he didn't call power an addiction, but he talked about the dangers of power, and he explained why the very people who want to have power are the people you least want to have power over you. Whether they have power because they want their own personal aggrandizement and or wealth, it's a grift for them. And the more dangerous ones that want power are the moralists that think they know better how everyone ought to live, that they have the special insight into what the world should look like and how everyone ought to live, that it would be best for them if they just lived the way we think you should, because they have no strict restraint on their ambition because they think they're doing it for your good. And those are the ones that are really dangerous to give power to, but they're the ones that are really attracted to power. And then he talks about sort of the grinding process of even good people, what they have to go through to get to power, the trade-offs they have to make, the fundraising, that it can grind you down, that there are very few politicians that get through that and can still hold to principles of liberty and things like that.
Yeah. Oh, there you are, Will. You're back. I guess the wind picked up in New Jersey to get your power back on. Got the lights on. There we go. All right. Yeah. And on the methane thing, I mean, I've seen it before America's western expansion. The Great Plains were filled with, I don't know, probably by a factor of 100 times the size of a buffalo herd than we have cattle on ranches here in the United States.
Yeah. The whole thing is, of course, crazy. Methane is a good sign. That means that you've got organisms on the earth that are using all of the cellulose that is produced by photosynthesis that we can't digest. Most animals are unable to digest cellulose, but it's a polymer of sugar, so it ought to be very nourishing, but you don't get very fat eating sawdust. But actually, cattle can put on weight eating at least some sawdust because they have this gut flora that's able to break down the cellulose and turn it into glucose and fatty acids and other things that the cattle can use and that we can use too in milk and cheese and roast beef. And so thank God for methane. You don't get any of that without methane belching out of the poor cow's mouth as they chew their cud.
Yep. Anthony, you wanted to weigh in here a little bit on methane?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that at our Climate at a Glance website and also in our version 2 of the book, we have a section on methane and livestock, and it's quite comprehensive. If you'll scroll down a little bit, you'll see that there's a nice big blue graph there that really tells the story. Within the livestock category in the United States, just 2% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are from cattle. So, and there's similar numbers elsewhere in the world. So it's not really a problem. And yeah, it does have a potential of warming 30 times more than a molecule of CO2. But as Dr. Happer points out, it's down in the parts per billion range, and it hasn't really changed much in the last 20 to 30 years. In fact, in the decade from 2000 to 2010, it actually went down globally which they couldn't explain. They didn't understand that. So just like most everything with the climate cultists, it's not a problem.
The methane went down even as fracking and natural gas production went up dramatically. They like to blame natural gas production for causing methane emission, for rise in methane, but it's not rising. And natural gas, it's actually going down. And they never talk about the fact that methane cycles out of the atmosphere fairly quickly. It's not a long-term thing. We can debate how long a molecule of CO2 emitted today stays in the atmosphere, but methane does not stay in the atmosphere for a very long time. 30 years, maybe less?
About 10, I think.
10,
yeah. And, one of the theories for why the methane stopped growing in the period you mentioned is that was the end of the Soviet Union, which, if you ever visited the Soviet Union or communist China, which I did in those days, they didn't maintain anything. So all the pipelines were leaking and nobody cared because it was nobody's making any money. Everyone was equally miserable. So once they brought in private ownership, the new owners of the pipelines realized they were losing tons of money by leaking methane into the air. So they fixed the leaks, and that greatly decreased the rate of increase of methane. There may have been other factors too, but that certainly was one of them.
Yeah. Well, we covered on last week's show, Will, we played a clip of Bill Gates saying that he wants to inject vaccines into all commercial cattle to stop them from burping and farting so much, to reduce the methane. And of course, he wants to actually ultimately get rid of all livestock and have lab grown meat, which I suppose will be powered by windmills and solar panels or something, and not fossil fuels, which of course is not how that would work. But there seems to be no end to crazy solutions to problems that don't exist.
I mean,
yeah, well, as someone once said, there's no cure for stupid.
Gates, I'm not sure Gates is stupid. What I think Gates is about is he sees another way of profiting, right? If he develops the vaccine and the government mandates it, well, it's his vaccine. He makes money off every dose. And if he gets rid of meat and he owns or large shares of both the prominent artificial meat companies, fake meat, near meat, both of which are now trading in dollar stock range. Once again, he makes a lot of money. Everyone thinks of him as a I'm having a senior moment here, a philanthropist. But I'm not convinced. I think these are just more money-making efforts for him. And if he can get government to enforce it, he makes a lot of money.
Yep.
It's just like the vaccines and, during COVID.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's another thing that Will and Dick and Joe Rogan talked about, was kind of following the money. In fact, that's a nice segue into the other little section I made for this discussion today. And that's the role of money and politics when it comes to so-called climate science, academia, and certainly climate policy. And I think these two videos I picked out speak to that a little bit. Let's try the one labeled cult, Andy, and we'll discuss that.
Religious thing, or a cult-like thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And they don't really, it's not like they've studied it a lot. And yeah, it's really interesting. And this is why I think that we've got to reduce CO2. And you have like this informed discussion with someone. You go, oh, okay. So when did you start reading about this? What book was that? Where, did you see this? And did you see that? And okay. And now you're having an informed discussion. But that's not what it's like. It's like you bring it up and they're like, oh, God. Yes. Climate change is settled. Climate change is settled. Yeah. Okay, you don't believe it. Even Bernie, when I had him on, when he was talking about climate change is a giant problem, and we started showing the Washington Post thing that says that we're in a global cooling period, and that it's raised up sometime over the last 100. But if you look at like the peaks and valleys, the main thing is like this has never been static. And I said to Bernie, I'm like, there's a lot of money in this, Bernie. Like, you've got to admit this. Like, this isn't something that we have to act on now to save each other. It might be something that we're being with, and that's what it seems like to me. It's like,
well, the question is, why does he find it so Why is he so enthusiastic?
It's wonderful for funding.
Yeah.
I think he's overall a very good person. I really do. And I think he would have been a fascinating president. But I think there are too many things to concentrate on in the world. And if you really want to do a deep dive into the actual science of climate and CO2's impact on climate and what actually causes us to get warmer or colder, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. And I don't know if the senator of Vermont has enough time to do that work and to really do it objectively, or to talk to someone like you, to have an informed conversation with someone who studied it for decades and go, okay, there's a lot more to this than I thought. And why does it fit in the same damn pattern where people get attached to an idea because that idea is attached to their ideology?
Yeah, exactly right. Now, Will, you said that, didn't want to necessarily get into the deep science with Joe Rogan or his audience, as they may not follow it very well. But that's something people can follow the money, right? And that there's an enormous financial, we're so far down the road with this stuff now, decades and decades. There's an enormous financial incentive to keep the train rolling in the same direction.
Yeah, that's been a particular problem in my field of academia, because so much money has been available. If you're willing to support the narrative that every university is lined up at the trough, mine included at Princeton. We have a huge building program here, much of it funded from overhead, from Saving the Planet grants. And so you don't give that up easily if you're a university administrator.
Yeah, I think the grants for climate, maybe 40 to 60% of those are bled away to administration of the grants, which of course can be bled away to building or whatever. I would say hearing, I've never met Bernie Sanders, so maybe he's a nice guy, but it seems to me that if you have really, really awful, pernicious ideas, you're probably not a nice person, especially if you're willing to enforce those ideas with force, as Bernie, a socialist, is. I think he's no more nice than Trotsky was. A true believer. He believes in socialism. And by gosh, he thinks we should enforce it upon people. Well, that doesn't make you a good person. That means you're willing to say the Constitution doesn't mean much because people shouldn't have certain freedoms because we know what's best. Collective ownership, restraining freedoms that would not allow us to take from some and give to others. That's not good. They call us fascist, but we believe in smaller government. We believe in less government. That's not fascism.
Well, not only that, Sterling, they say that we're swimming in all this funding from big oil or wherever. Like, it's the skeptic side that has got all this funding, and that's, well, as you pointed out on the show, Will, that's not the case. I mean, and it's actually pretty corrupt. I was shocked when you said that 50% at least of climate grants from the government, which means you and me, the taxpayer, goes to the university to spend however they like on quote unquote overhead. And so maybe you'll get a new cafeteria or a new student union or something like that, I suppose, at Princeton instead of, it's a scam.
That's true, though, for any federal grant. It could be a grant for biomedical research or a grant for geology. The university has an overhead rate, which, they deserve some overhead because, somebody has to pay for maintaining the buildings and keeping the lights on and keeping the heat on. But the overhead that's necessary for that is much less than 50%. So the good thing about this discussion, and I hope the Trump administration hangs tough, is, let's get the overhead rates back to something that's honest again, rather than a cash cow for universities to promote whatever they're wanting to promote, rather than support research.
That's what Eisenhower warned about in his farewell address. The second part of his farewell address was the dangers of big government being co-opted by, big science funded by government, or opposite, government, big science being corrupted by government. Now, concerning the rolling in oil money, I could walk around with my computer and show you all the house repairs that I need. I wish I were rolling in oil money, because my wife would be, she'd say, we can do this now and we can do this. And it would just happen because oil money's big money.
Indeed. All right. We have another clip here for you to react to. And it must be kind of difficult, Will, to react to your own videos, but we're going to try to make you do it anyway. But here you are talking about, I think this is also related to the role of money in politics in the corruption of science, and maybe the development of science that was once considered legit and then later was not, and that is in eugenics. So let's play that clip, please, Andy.
Open, free discussion and debating ideas based on their merit and what data you have. That's what it's supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be attached to an ideology. And I just don't understand how it got this far and how it can be separated. So when did it really become a problem where ideology started invading into certain segments of science?
Oh, well, it's happened many times in the past, Joe. Climate is only the most recent.
So it's just a natural thing that happens.
Well, for example, there was the eugenics movement in America and Britain and Western Europe, where the claim was that the great gene pool, of the Anglo-Saxon race was being diluted by all these low-Q Italians and Eastern European Jews and Chinamen. It was all completely nonsense, but they had learned journals where you could publish an article that proved that, and you had the presidents of Harvard and Stanford and Princeton, Alexander Graham Bell being great eugenicists, protecting the American genome, and it was all nonsense. It was just complete bullshit. And yet, and the only thing that stopped it really was the Nazis, because they took it over with a vengeance. They were big fans of the eugenics movement in America and Britain, and they took it to its absurd extreme.
The average person that's not involved in science always wants to think of science as being this incredibly pure thing amongst intellectuals, or they're trying to figure out how the world works. When you hear stories like that, you hear that kind of stuff, and you're just like, oh, this has always been a problem.
You're dealing with people.
Human beings.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? That's getting to the heart of the problem.
Yeah. Joe says this famous quote by Immanuel Kant, from the crooked timber of mankind, no straight thing was ever made.
Ooh,
that goes for science as well as every other aspect of human society.
What could have been done?
You and Dick Lindzen got to speak with Joe Rogan for a little over 2 hours. That might be my favorite little snippet of the entire interview.
Well, thanks. You can thank Immanuel Kant. It sounds better in German.
Yeah, eugenics sounds better in the original German as well. But maybe you can expand on this. I don't know, Will, but I think the point you were trying to make was that eugenics was once, in the early 20th century, it was all the rage. It was a respectable and respected science that was written in the so-called academic, journals of record. And I think the point you were trying to make was that maybe one day they will look at what has been published as quote unquote climate science over the last 20, 30 years in the same way.
Well, I'm sure that will happen because, what's being proposed is really a suicide pact for society. People are not going to commit suicide. So the only real issue is not whether the climate cult will collapse, but how much damage will be done before that happens. And so what I've been trying to do, and all of my allies, good friends, is to get it to collapse sooner rather than later so it doesn't cause so much harm.
Dick's brief comment there that, we're dealing with people brings to mind James Madison's Federalist 51 to me. It says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. And no controls on government would be needed. However, since government is administered by men over men, the challenge is to first enable government to control the governed, then oblige it to control itself.
Well, good. I agree with that, Sterling. And if I can show a little bit of Princeton chauvinism, Madison was a Princeton graduate.
There you go. You might want to wave your hands again, Will. One of your lights may have gone out.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, yeah. Just making sure we're keeping you lit. All right. Yes, excellent. So actually, we were going to get into the other section here, I thought, or at least as a kind of a broad topic of that was discussed over those 2 hours with Joe Rogan, was the corruption in the science journals. Now, you two did get to talk to Rogan and his audience about this in some detail. Dick from personal experience, and I have a couple clips about that. So that was another one that definitely stood out. That subject area definitely stood out to me and other people I talked to about this. So, Andy, if you could play Papers, please.
When you first started discussing this, and when you first started getting interested in this, how much pushback did you get?
Interesting question. Actually, quite a lot, but I mean, it took very funny forms. So, for instance, in 1989, for instance, I sent a paper to Science magazine questioning whether this is something to worry about. And they sent it back immediately saying there was no interest. So I sent it to the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, and they reviewed it and published it, and the editor was immediately fired. About 10 years later, working with some colleagues at NASA, we found something called the iris effect, that clouds, which were greenhouse effect at the upper levels, contracted when it got warm, letting more heat out, so cooling as a negative feedback. And we got the paper, got reviewed, was published. Again, the editor was fired immediately. But the new editor came on immediately and said, he's inviting papers to criticize it. And suddenly there were tons of papers criticizing it, looking for anything that differed from what we did.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think the timeline on that, I think he said 1989 or so, 88 or 89 when he first submitted that paper, and the guy was immediately fired. So this has been going on for quite a long time.
And continues
the whole
today.
thing didn't come to be until June of 1988 when Hansen went before Congress and made his pitch. And, that's when it really took off, because then Congress started throwing money at the problem. And once money starts being thrown at the problem, no one wants to interrupt the gravy train.
Right.
So I got. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Will. I got the impression from the beginning of the conversation with Rogan that obviously you weren't in quote unquote climate science, which doesn't really exist. I mean, there's different disciplines that examine the climate, right? But that it wasn't really a big focus of your academic life until a little later in your career. Whereas Dick Lindzen seemed to have been involved in it a little bit earlier, if that's a correct surmise on my part. But were you also noticing? When did you first start noticing that the scientific journals were being completely corrupted by ideology, and were not interested in an open debate about questioning what's happening to the planet or in any other discipline?
Well, I first realized there's something funny about climate when I was director of energy research under Bush Sr., President Bush Sr. That was 1990 to 1993. So it was not long after the infamous congressional testimony of Jim Hansen and Al Gore and Tim Wirth. And, but already then there was a big climate alarm constituency in the universities and elsewhere. And so I would often invite, in fact, each week I would invite someone we were supporting research for to come to Washington and brief me on what they were doing in case I had to explain it to the Congress. Why are you spending, $300,000 a year at New York University? And I would wanted to be sure I knew the answer to that. And most of the researchers were just delighted to have an invitation to come to Washington. You know, some bureaucrat was interested. Maybe that will mean I'll get even more funding next year. You know, a lot of it's always been driven by money. But when we would send an invitation to someone in the climate business, often the first response was just a refusal. You know, we work for Senator Gore. Well, I said, you better check your contract, because, you know, the person who signed it wasn't Senator Gore, it was me. And if you don't want our money next year, I've got lots of other applicants who be happy to take it. So it was pretty clear then that things were not healthy in climate. But, you know, I was a political appointee by Mr. Bush. And so when he lost the election to Clinton and Gore, Gore wanted to clean house as fast as he could. So he told his staff, get rid of me. It took him a little time to find me in the org chart, but they eventually did. And I was fired. I was happy to be fired. I couldn't wait to go home. And I've been grateful to Gore all my life for that, actually. So he's certainly not on my enemies list. But that was when I began to realize there's something not right about climate. It's not like normal science.
Yep.
It's post-normal science. It's the corruption of science by sort of not progressivism. I can't remember the name of it anyway.
Well, it's really tragic because the climate is important, you know, and we don't understand it very well. And it would be nice to have honest people trying to fix that lack of understanding. And so I was a big supporter of research on climate when I was at Department of Energy. And for example, I helped to get what we call the ARM program going, which was a ground-based set of instruments to measure atmospheric properties. And I've always been very happy that we have satellites measuring temperature and, you know, anything else they can measure on the Earth. So those are invaluable pieces of evidence. I think where we're really squandering money is on these massive computer models, which they don't mean anything. You know, they're sort of, you know, inkblot tests, and and yet most of the alarm comes from these models, which have no predictive power.
Well, they have a record to go by, and it's not good.
I said post-normal science. I meant postmodern science. It's a bleed over from philosophy of science. The idea that there's no objectivity. There's no objective truth. You can't discover things through experimentation. What really matters is what people agree on and believe in. That's where you get the idea of consensus. That's where, you know, it's if enough people gather together in a room or on the internet and they believe that 2 and 2 equals 5, then, you know, that's the truth now. It's just, it's all a cultural construct.
No, you're right. There are some people that believe what you said. Fortunately, not many people, but some.
But too many. All right, we got a few more clips.
I don't know if it's just me. Jim seems frozen.
Yeah, he is.
Okay, well, it's not my computer for once.
Even now, there's something called gatekeepers. I don't know. Are you familiar with the release of emails from East Anglia?
No, I'm not.
Okay. This is 20 years ago or something almost. Somebody anonymous released the emails from a place in England, the University of East Anglia, which has a lot of people pushing climate alarm, and they were communicating with other people like Michael Mann and so on. And they were talking about blocking publication and getting rid of editors and doing this and doing that and so on. And that was all public. Wow. And it had no impact at all.
That sounds like that should be illegal.
Yeah. Well, the whole business with, how shall I put it, peer review, it is not ancient. Before World War II, very few journals had peer review. And in fact, when I have students look at old journals from the 19th century, one of the big surprises is they are less formal than today's papers. They are literally discussions among scientists about their results, their questions, their uncertainties, and so on. There's real communication.
Yeah. Well, and also the way that science is funded has been dramatically changed over the last century, too. It used to be science was funded by having sponsors. People that were wealthy or affluential or whatever would sponsor. They would become patrons of science. And there was a sort of an implied, go with what you know, find out what you can sort of a thing, as opposed to this oversight like we have now with government grants, where the government grant says, well, you signed up to prove X and Y, right? Now, we need a report that shows that you proved X and Y, otherwise you're not going to get the next grant. And so you go down the road and you say, well, geez, X and Y never really turned out. And so you create this fudge paper so you continue to get more money. And so it makes criminals out of people that used to be honest. They're basically there for the money.
Well, it also involves just survival in academia, where, to be promoted and to get tenure, you have to show a big publication record, and you have to show success in getting government grants so that the administration can get its 50% overhead. And so, you can't be too hard on the participants of this. They're just trying to survive. And, unless they're already independently wealthy, they're forced to go along with the system. But you're right. In the old days, it was independently wealthy people who did science, or people who were supported by independently wealthy people.
It was
Lord Rayleigh, for example, one of the great physicists. His family was quite wealthy. They ran the milk business in London, Rayleigh's Dairy. And he was terrific, but he was not funded by the government. He was funded by his family.
It was like it was like art back then. Used to artists had patrons, and the successful artists and the ones that weren't successful, even if their art turned out to be great, didn't have patrons, and so for lifetimes they didn't do well. In addition, a lot of the science back then was not purely theoretical. A lot of it was geared towards benefiting mankind. What can we do? What can we study to help humans do better? This science isn't about humans doing better. They believe that the Earth is some kind of living, almost a living entity, Gaia, and that it has a health, some health you can measure, and that we know how to measure its health, and that we're destroying Gaia.
Yeah. Well, I'm back. I'm sorry to have dropped out there. My cat jumped on my foot and I moved it, and I accidentally unplugged my computer completely and was able to come back on. So thank you, Frankie, for being a part of the show today. But I wanted to play that part because about ClimateGate, about the emails in East Anglia, because again, now millions of people know about that didn't know about it. It's kind of in the past, but it's a very important part of the story about the corruption of academia by ideologues who are trying to push an agenda, not trying to seek truth. There's another clip here. I've labeled it Deniers. It's again Dick Lindzen, I think, talking about this subject in a different way. If you could play that, please, Andy.
The key, though, is also making it a subject that you cannot challenge. There's no room for any rational debate, and if you discuss it at all, you are now a climate change denier.
Yeah.
Which is like being an anti-vaxxer or, fill in the blank with whatever other horrible thing you could be called.
Now, that's a very interesting phenomenon. I mean, I was looking at it. on the one hand, you're told the science is settled. Thousands of the world's leading climate scientists all agree, which often makes you wonder. I mean, you went to college. How many climate scientists did you know? I mean, 1,000. But on the other hand, if you read the IPCC reports, they're pointing out, for instance, that water vapor and clouds are much bigger than CO2, and we don't understand them at all. So here you have the biggest phenomena we don't understand at all, but the science is settled. Who knows what that means?
Yeah, Will Happer. I mean, that to me, again, this interview was just fantastic. I encourage everybody listening to this podcast to go find it and play it. It's wonderful. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes of conversation, wide ranging. But a big point that needs to be made for regular lay people is that climate science is hardly settled, that there are aspects of the climatic observation that we can't even accurately measure and understand, including water vapor and clouds.
Absolutely. That's the big elephant in the whole climate business is water in all its forms, including the oceans.
Yeah.
One of the things that I always found the most interesting about these reports, these huge tomes the IPCC puts out, is how the executive summaries often don't match the body of the document very well, with all its caveats and uncertainties, but also how they usually produce charts that sort of admit how little they know about the factors that affect the climate. So you'll see they'll have a graphic that shows water vapor or cloud. They say poorly understood. They give a range of its impact, but it's only poorly understood. And they'll say ocean currents, and they'll say poorly understood. And then they get to CO2, the one thing they're studying, or the other greenhouse gases, the little area they're studying, and it's well understood, and they're convinced the little thing that they understood really well is what's driving all of it, wherein all these other factors, 7 or 8 other factors, they don't understand it all. They say they poorly understand it. They're not studying it, and yet they're convinced they're having no impact on climate. It's maddening.
Yes, certainly. Let me just add to that there are some honest climate scientists and who recognize that water vapor and clouds are the main issue, and they also recognize that CO2, the one thing that we do understand pretty well, is almost a trivial effect. It's certainly not the control knob. It doesn't have the oomph to do that. So, they've spent enormous efforts to try and pretend that CO2 triggers effects of water vapor and triggers effects of clouds. And so it's amplified effects that are what make CO2 so dangerous. But there's no evidence that they're amplified at all. In fact, most natural systems have negative feedback. So what little direct warming CO2 has, and it's less than 1 degree, 1 degree or less, that's probably an overestimate if it's like all other natural systems. So the real warming from doubling CO2, I'd be surprised if it's more than 0.5 degree. We will know before long, but most of the warming we've seen, it started in 1800, maybe a little earlier, long before there was any increase of CO2. So it has warmed, but it's almost certainly mostly natural.
Yeah. I will point out that CO2 does have a warming effect, but it's in the very lower ranges. The first few hundred parts per million warm the most, but once you get past a certain point, the warming becomes less and less and less because it's a logarithmic response curve in the atmosphere. Is that right, Dr. Happer?
That's correct. Absolutely correct.
So a doubling of CO2 really wouldn't have the same effect, let's say from 100 to 200 versus 400 to 800.
That's right. Both of them will cause the same warming, but in one case it's 400 parts per million. In the other case, it's only 200 parts per million. So it's really the ratios that count. That's the logarithmic effect, and that's been known since before 1900. Arrhenius himself recognized or guessed that it was logarithmic. So and yet they all deny that now. When I say CO2 effects are saturated, they say no, absolutely not. That we've changed all that, but it's really true. And even they themselves, I mentioned Steve Schneider, used the words saturation again and again when he was a global cooling alarmist. So
okay.
Arrhenius himself also thought warming would be good for the planet. Thought it would be good for humankind. He was not what you would call a climate alarmist.
Yeah, and he was right that warming will be good for the planet.
Yeah. I have a favorite cartoon from several years ago by the resident cartoonist over What's Up With That by the name of Josh. And he came up with this wonderful cartoon that shows just how scientists, climate scientists anyway, look at things, but the reality is that water vapor is the big control knob for the atmosphere. And CO2, well, it's just a little tiny knob over here in the lower left. And that's really what it is. But the problem is the climate science community and the media, they go with this view that climate control knob is big, it's huge, it's linear, not logarithmic, and we're all going to die.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead, Sterling. Then we'll move on.
If they admit it's water vapor, then the funding goes away because we can do nothing to control water vapor.
Well, we should all try and remember to say water vapor and clouds because clouds are at least as important as water vapor.
Yeah. And before I actually move on to one last clip, speaking about water vapor, have you been able to look to see if the effect of the Hunga Tonga volcano eruption and the huge emission of water vapor into the atmosphere, have there been studies that are looking at what effect that has had so far and if it's dissipating?
Well, I haven't personally looked at it, so I'm reluctant to say, but my hunch is that it's not been very important. It's a lot of water vapor, but only relatively speaking. There's not much water vapor in the stratosphere to begin with.
Right.
So if you double zero, it's still zero.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, a lot of our viewers ask about that.
I haven't looked at it carefully, so I take it for what it's worth.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot. That's fine. I mean, a lot of our viewers ask about that from time to time. So just occurred to me here. All right. Wait, one more clip we could play here, and then we'll get to Q&A. And it was kind of like the discussion wound its way around to whether we will see an end to the climate cult, and it has a little something to do with how we power our societies and how expensive that's getting. So can you play nuclear, please, Andy?
When we make models based on incorrect data about like CO2 levels and what the temperature in the future is going to look like, at what point in time do you think another country needs to screw up the same way Nazi Germany ran with eugenics and it ruined eugenics in the United States, where they're like, oh my God, this is a horrific idea? Do you think something like that has to happen in another country where they have to take this climate change, green energy thing to its full end? You think so?
I think that's how it will end, yes. Yeah. I think Britain or Germany may be the sacrificial country.
Because Germany has shut off a couple of their nuclear power plants, correct?
Yeah, right. All of their nuclear power plants.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Yeah. So this idea that actually, I remember I was in the car listening to it a second time, and that part where Joe Rogan was gobsmacked of all of their nuclear power plants because of Fukushima, which I don't think a tsunami is going to be hitting Hanover, Germany any day soon, but that they got rid of all of it. And so maybe you can expand on that idea that I think we're starting to see that tipping point that a lot of climate alarmists like to talk about in a different way, but at that tipping point on how the actual implementation of policies that depend on radical, unscientific climate viewpoints is coming to a head.
Well, as we discussed with Joe, many people think, and I certainly think that some unfortunate country or perhaps some unfortunate state, maybe the state of California, will do everything that the green alarmists demand, and it's suicidal. And so people will start to suffer sufficiently that they finally say enough is enough, let's stop this. But in the meantime, they've destroyed their country, they've destroyed their state, and the other more backward parts of the world that haven't screwed up their courage to do everything that the climate alarmists demand will have a chance then to stop before they've run over the cliff, like this bad example. So, if you look at the course of history, that's happened more than once.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you, Dr. Happer, for being able to get facts out to millions of people that never have heard these facts before. And I'm sure a lot of people that watched had an epiphany and said, wait a minute. The other thing I want to congratulate you on is for having the most hair in that podcast.
Well, thank you. I do need a haircut. You're right.
You're just shoving it in their faces by not getting a haircut. See? Yeah, and that's the important thing about this, and why we wanted to dedicate the whole show to it, because this was such an important moment in the communication of climate realism. This show has been around. What are we on, episode 179 right now, and it's for a niche audience. I think we do a fantastic job, and consistently every single week trying to bring the truth to the people. But you got to go find this podcast. Everybody knows the Joe Rogan podcast. He's made international news with that. His videos are routinely seen on YouTube millions of times. I think his interview with Donald Trump, hit 30 million within 24 hours. Your video, you and Dick Lindzen, Will Happer, 862,000, I think, currently on YouTube. That has blown right past Lionel Richie. Joe Rogan had Lionel Richie on his show just 2 weeks ago, and you've blown past Lionel Richie. So you're hotter than Lionel Richie right now.
To show you what a nerd I am, I don't even know who Lionel Richie is.
Wow, that's even more impressive. No, he was one of the biggest pop stars of the 80s. That's all he was. But very famous person, let's just say that. And so congratulations on that. This is going to be seen by millions. Clips of this are going to be seen by millions more on social media. They already are going around. So this is an epochal moment, I think, in the process of climate realism communication. And Joe Rogan could not have picked two better people to do that than Will Happer and Dick Lindzen. And so it's a credit to him, and especially a credit to you and Dick for how well you communicated the truth to people who have never heard it before. And that's really the important thing. So congratulations.
Well, thanks, Jim. Dick and I share a lot of history. We're both products of World War II. Dick's family just barely escaped the Nazis. My father fought the Nazis with the 8th Army in North Africa, and my mother worked on the Manhattan Project. And so this isn't the first tough customer I've faced in my life, and we'll beat this one too.
Yep. All right. Well, we're going to get to Q&A.
Oh. Well, then you can now say that he's a gentleman, a scholar, and a patriot.
Yep. 100%. And I don't want you to tell these stories on this podcast, Will, because I want people to go over and watch the interview. But you told a joke that involved Heisenberg, and you also explained how key you were to the Strategic Defense Initiative with an invention of yours involving lasers. I will just leave it there. If that's not enough to entice people to go watch it, I don't know what is, because they are fascinating stories and a good joke.
Thank you.
All right. So we're going to get to Q&A here. But before we get into that, I have something to tell you about our sponsor for this program, which is Advisor Metals. If you listen to a lot of conservative shows, not Rogan's, he doesn't have big gold advertising on his show, but a lot of conservative podcasts do. And you hear on all of those shows all these pitches for buying gold, silver, and other precious metals. And with all these other companies out there, I want to tell you why you should trust our sponsor, Advisor Metals. And it's because of the man who runs the company, Ira Brashatsky. He's the managing member of Advisor Metals, and he doesn't employ the high-pressure tactics and deceptive marketing ploys you often see among big gold. He also doesn't deal in so-called rare coins. When you buy gold and other precious metals from Advisor Metals, you are dealing in quality bullion. And that is so much better when the time comes to liquidate this valuable physical asset. So also, when you buy from Advisor Metals, you'll have your investment sent discreetly right to your own home. So Ira is also, I must note, advertising on this program. because he likes the program, but he's also an America First patriot. He doesn't donate to Democrats. He refuses to work with proxies of the Chinese Communist Party, and he, like us, abhor the machinations of organizations like the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. And so we are very proud to have him as a sponsor. If you want to diversify your portfolio, if you want to back up your IRA with real physical bullion of precious metals, please go to climaterealism.com/metals. You can leave your information there, and Ira will make the process very easy for you when he gets in contact with you. So again, climaterealismshow.com/metals, and be sure to tell them that we sent you there, because that helps this program while you're helping your financial future. All right. Thank you very much for your attention to this matter. It is time for Q&A. We already have a lot of questions in the queue right now, but if you have a question on, I guess, any topic for Will or anyone on the panel, you can leave them in the comments, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. All right. Let's see. Let's try this one here first. This is from Bob Berry. He says, was the Ice Age the result of a cold phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation?
Well, I don't know whether that's for Anthony or me, but I will try to answer. The Ice Age, the period, the time period you're talking about is tens of thousands of years. So it's a completely different period from the multi-decadal oscillations. So whatever caused it, and by the way, the Ice Age is still going on. It started maybe 5 million years ago with first little fluctuations in temperature and ice, and now much bigger ones. There's no reason to expect it to stop now. But it probably is some combination of the Milankovitch mechanism and perhaps some help from the sun. We really don't understand the sun very well in spite of the science being settled, and it's the main driver of our climate.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. Milankovitch cycles probably were the major influence. There might have been some minor influences, such as changes in certain ocean currents, but I think Milankovitch cycles were the main driver.
Got it. All right. Here's a question from Leachy2 for Dr. Happer. Do you have an estimate of how much the Earth would warm if hypothetically CO2 went from the current 400 parts per million to 4,000 parts per million?
Well, that's a factor of, 10. Is that right? 4,000 divided by 400. And 10 is roughly 2 to the power 3.5. Okay. And so every doubling of CO2, by my guess, is on the order of, say, 0.7 degrees centigrade, probably less, but so suppose you turn 0.7, so it's 0.7 times 3.5, which is a little more than 2 degrees centigrade. But we're not likely to get to 4,000.
Can I ask though, is it, I mean, that sounds like sort of an admission that CO2 really is a driver. And looking at the really ancient proxy data we have, we've seen periods when CO2 was 5,000 parts per million and temperatures were cooler than today. And times when CO2 was lower and temperatures were warmer. So do you really think it's that direct, that if you just add the CO2, all things, no other factors?
2 degrees isn't very much. You can easily get 10 degrees of cooling by, changes in solar radiation, changes in ocean current.
Right. Yeah.
You're overreacting. That's not a very big temperature difference.
Yeah.
Just a point of order, Sterling, for making that comment. If you were the editor of a journal, you'd get fired for saying that.
I wouldn't be hired as an editor of a journal because I would fail out during the interview process when they ask me questions about climate.
Yeah.
Well, all right. here we go. This is from regular viewer, Above Us Only Sky. Welcome back. Question for Dr. Happer. Could you give us a brief overview of CO2 saturation in the atmosphere, or is it a misconception?
Well, thank you for that question. There's a lot of confusion out there about what saturation means. And when I talk about saturation of CO2, I'm using the language of astrophysics and physics and radiation transfer. And there, all you mean by saturation is that if you double, the concentration of CO2, you don't double the effect. You have a much smaller effect than doubling. And that's the way it's normally used in astronomy and physics. But for example, if you're a chemist and you talk about, this water is saturated with salt, I've got 100 grams or whatever the value is per liter. If you put, 500 grams is, you can still only dissolve 100 grams. So what a chemist means by saturation is different from what a radiation transfer specialist means, like myself. So yes, of course, CO2 is heavily saturated. Jim began the program by showing the logarithmic effect of more CO2. But what it means for radiation transfer is we're in a region of very strongly diminishing returns. Each addition of more CO2 has a smaller and smaller effect. The effect isn't zero. The effect is zero in chemistry, but it's not zero in radiation transfer. So I hope that gives the flavor of what I think some of the confusion is.
Sterling, you had something you wanted to ask Dr. Happer?
Yeah, so I don't want to ask what you discussed on Rogan that you'd like to bring up that we didn't bring up, because we want people to watch the Rogan interview. But were there topics or questions you wished Rogan had asked that he didn't, that you think are important for the public to know, that's something that wouldn't show up in his interview?
Well, actually, no, Sterling. I think he did a pretty good job. He had a limited amount of time. It wasn't a seminar on physics or climate. It's a general audience. So I'm sure I could not have run an interview that well.
Did he ask anything about policy, or do you have any thoughts on policy?
Well, of course, I think we talked a little bit about policy earlier, and policy means power, right? And maybe we should have spent a little more time talking about the endangerment finding, which I hope will be repealed. I hope that the administration will have the courage to drive that home and rescind the endangerment finding. It's a absolutely absurd finding. But, there's a limited amount of time. And I guess that's the one thing I would have liked to say a little more, because it might have helped Mr. Selden and the EPA to defend themselves if they make the right decision.
Yep. All right, let's go to another question here. This is from regular viewer Climate Bell. Question: the assurances made in the 1985 Senate hearing on rising CO2 don't seem to align with the vague IPCC range possibilities in 2021 for a doubling of CO2. Do you have theories on what went wrong?
Well, it's pretty well known that all of the climate models are running hot, very hot. They're predicting much more warming than is being observed. And the situation is probably worse than people realize, because most of the warming is probably natural and not from CO2 at all. But probably the biggest issue is clouds and water vapor in the models. The way they model that is very primitive, and maybe subconsciously it's designed to try and make CO2 look as bad as possible. And so, you can only jigger the calculation so much before it doesn't make sense at all. I think they're in that situation now.
Yeah. Well, I've got a couple of questions here. I'm going to maybe go a little rapid fire on these two. I mean, Will Happer, you are one of the founders of the CO2 Coalition, which is doing fantastic work. And Your purpose is in your name. So let's look. Here's a couple CO2 questions here for you. This is an interesting one from Jason Holtz. Did CO2 starvation contribute to the megafauna extinctions? I know you and Dick actually talked a little bit about that with the ice ages and the migration of humans going to where it was warmer.
Well, that's an interesting question. The honest answer is I don't know, but it certainly.
And that's the mark of a good scientist. The guys that are climate scientists, when you ask them a question like this, they will come up with something, just tie it to CO2, whatever. They will never say, "I just don't know."
Okay, well, but I, like anyone else, I can speculate, and certainly one of the most damning things is that the megafauna extinctions in North America, for example, did seem to be coincident with humans coming into North America. So certainly human population of North America is one of the suspects. But it's also true that the glaciers were receding, and my guess is that the starvation was probably not very important, but it's only a guess.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, humans are the apex predator, so that's how that works. Here's another one here from Michael. Do we know what the human contribution is to the level of CO2 in our atmosphere?
Well, we certainly know how much CO2 humans are emitting, because that's something you can get by how much oil was sold, how much coal was sold, how many humans are on the planet breathing. Each of us breathes out about 2 pounds of CO2 a day. So with 7 billion people, that's a lot of CO2. So we don't, just by living, we make some contribution. But I think we know the human contribution very well. I'd be surprised if there's more than a few percent uncertainty there.
Right. Okay. Another CO2 question for somebody from the CO2 Coalition. Is the saturation of CO2 driven by insufficient energy to absorb or something else? Do we know? Thank you, Mike Gattuso.
Yeah, we understand saturation of CO2 well. It's hard to really discuss it on this podcast, but it's not due to insufficient energy. It's because of the temperature structure of the atmosphere. The atmosphere temperature drops for the first 10 kilometers or so until you get to the tropopoles. And then, there's a nearly isothermal lower stratosphere where the temperature hardly changes, and then it goes up again. And that, combined with the peculiar absorption cross-section of CO2 for infrared radiation, does give you a logarithmic law. It's not terribly complicated, but it's a little hard to discuss it, on this. But I would say, yes, we understand exactly why it's logarithmic.
Excellent. All right. Wheelman, another regular viewer. Hello, Wheelman. I like this question quite a bit. If you have to tune the models, doesn't that mean that they might need to rethink the whole model? I've always wondered that too.
Well, the model has lots of numbers that you have to put into the computer program to mock up something that's too hard to calculate. That would take thousands of numbers. You try to approximate it with one. And, with models with too many tuning parameters, they really have no predictive power, and that's been obviously true for climate models. If you tell them what the answer is, they'll tune it to get the answer. But if you look at, if you ask them to predict what will you see in 10 years, and you compare what they predict, and you can do that now with some of the early models, none of them worked. The warming has been much less than the predictions. And so I'm not criticizing them. This is a very complicated system. Anthony, who his profession is weather, can tell you how complicated weather is. It's fluid dynamics, it's radiation, it's the oceans, it's clouds. And so no wonder it's hard to predict. But the one thing that's easy to predict is the effect of CO2, and the effect is very small. So,
I think it's fair to criticize them. And the reason is, it's not that it isn't hard to do. It's that despite the fact that they do it, they know it's hard to do, and they know they don't get it right, they still say, you should listen to us in our predictions and our policy recommendations for what you should do. I mean, if you say, my models don't work, but listen to them anyway, there's something going on there.
Well, you've got a point, Shirley.
For sure. All right, a few more questions here. This is from longtime viewer Chris Nisbet, I believe is from New Zealand. We have a very international audience, Will. It's really amazing to see people from all over the world. Chris asks, I have recently seen claims that plants are losing the ability to absorb CO2 due to climate change. Is there any justification for this at all? Anthony, you rolled your eyes. You can go first.
Okay, yeah, I gave myself away with the eye rolling. Okay, so the simple answer is let's look at greenhouses. Greenhouses typically run concentrations of carbon dioxide at 2,000 to 4,000 parts per million. Okay, we're at 420 and change parts per million in the atmosphere right now. So just by that alone, are plants losing their ability to absorb CO2? Not just no, but hell no. It's just simply another stupid talking point that no one's really investigated. If you can run plants in 2,000 to 4,000 parts per million, they're not losing their ability at 420 and change.
I agree with Anthony, and let me just add a few words because he said most of it. But what the claims may be referring to is that there's something called Liebig's barrel. You know, when you finish this show, you might Google on Liebig's barrel, but Liebig's barrel basically says that if you want plants to grow faster, if you give them more CO2, they'll grow faster, but unless you give them more nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus, after a while they'll use all those up, and then they will stop benefiting from more CO2.
That's right.
So in greenhouses, you're careful. If you raise the CO2 level, you also increase the fertilization. And if you're growing crops, you have to do the same thing. So there's nothing surprising about this. And if you're willing to add fertilizer, you'll get bigger and bigger yields, even in the open air.
Right. And, you know, it's called Liebig's Law of the Minimum. And I wrote about it over a decade ago on What's Up With That. But it's the most important law of plant growth. Whatever, they call it Liebig's barrel of holding water. Because whatever the shortest stave is in the barrel, whether it's carbon dioxide or light or fertilizer or open space, you know, that is the determining thing for the growth factor of the plant.
Right.
Interesting.
All
right. Go ahead, Sterling.
There used to be a group, I don't know how active they are anymore, called CO2 Science, that documented not a few dozen, not a few hundred, thousands of both field and lab experiments that shows you keep putting in CO2. It's not a closed system. You have other factors, but if you keep adding CO2 and you manage the other factors, you keep getting growth. Both the root systems improve, the reproductive cycle improves, the leaf structures improve, and if it's crops, fruits, things like that, the fruiting improves.
No, Sterling, you're right. That was the Idso family. They were just terrific, and Craig Idso is still around, and his father Sherwood was a real hero in this area. He was beat up unmercifully by Al Gore.
Right. You know, I think Liebig's barrel would be a great name for a whiskey. You know, it got a nice woody taste to it. You know,
it's a great name for a metal band too, actually. So, all right. So, Will Happer, if you don't know the answer to this question, that's okay. But I figure if somebody who's never heard of Lionel Richie, you might know the answer to this question. So we'll try it.
Okay.
So this is from Stephen Lindsay Ewell, who I think is a new viewer. Welcome, Stephen. Can I ask Dr. Happer about cosine weighting method, which adjusts temperature averages by the cosine of latitude to account for the decreased surface area toward the poles and it masks extreme cold temperatures.
Well, I don't know details about this, but I think the basic idea is correct, that as you approach the poles, you look up and the sun is just barely above the horizon. So you're not getting as much radiation as if you're in the tropics or near the equator. You look up, the sun's overhead, and so all of that radiation is coming directly down instead of just a little bit skimming the surface. So I don't know the details of how it's done, but something like that needs to be done to account for the different angles of the solar radiation. A lot of people don't realize one interesting fact, which is if you ask what part of the Earth's surface gets the most solar energy in a day, and the answer is the North Pole at midsummer. It gets more energy in 24 hours than the hottest it ever gets at the equator. And it's because it's got 24 hours of sunlight. So it's very surprising, but that's actually true.
Well, I guess that's why
plants grow so well in Alaska. You know, if they grow quickly, they can take advantage of these long daylight hours. And that makes a huge difference.
Yep.
Yeah, well, they have to put mirrors in space now to reflect that, to keep the ice from melting.
Oh.
Yeah. What do they call that? A Dyson sphere? That will just build a Dyson sphere all around the globe and empower ourselves with the sun all the way around. So, yeah.
Well, Freeman Dyson was one of my closest friends. I miss him. He was a true warrior.
Yeah. Wonderful. All right. One last question here, and then we will wrap it up for the day. This is from Jason Holt again. Forgive me if you've been in the chat before, but I don't recognize your name, and we'll get used to you. What is the one indisputable fact that best wins the argument with a climate catastrophist?
Well, I've never had any luck arguing with climate catastrophists with any argument. You know, they've sort of made up their mind and, don't confuse me with facts. So, but if I think the person has some independent thought left, I often remind them about the geological history of the Earth, that we know pretty well that CO2 levels have been much higher in the past and nothing bad happened. In fact, the Earth was more verdant at high CO2 levels than low CO2 levels. And, if you've got a person who's willing to open their mind a little, I often start with that argument.
Yeah. Anthony, actually, this is a good thing to go around the horn on real quick. What do you think is the one fact that is most effective when you're talking, not necessarily with a climate catastrophist, but maybe just somebody ignorant about climate science and about what's happening to the climate, and they've passively absorbed the alarmist message?
Well, I could think of a number of facts that, are indisputable. But the problem with arguing with climate alarmists is facts don't matter. It's like that cartoon game show. Facts don't matter. You were penalized because you didn't, your answer didn't include feelings or whatever. And that's the problem we've got with a lot of these folks. They're feelings driven. Oh, we're killing the planet. Oh, we're killing the future. Oh, we're killing our children and grandchildren, and so their mindset and their view of climate has nothing to do with facts, almost exclusively about feelings. And you can't really combat feelings with facts.
Yeah. Well,
I can add, there's this old proverb, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So that's where many of them are.
That's exactly right.
I guess, I don't know. I mean, I agree with both Anthony and Dr. Happer that there's no argument, I think, that can convince, no set of facts, no set of data that can convince a true, a dogmatic believer in climate alarm. There are scientists out there that believe in climate alarm that aren't dogmatic. That one of them told me time would convince him, because over time, either predictions would fail to come true or they would come true. And if enough of them didn't fail to come true, then he'd have to reject the theory. I think that was the right answer for science. But for me, the most effective argument with people who are a little bit open-minded, and there are a lot of people out there that are still open-minded, is show me a prediction that's come true. I can list 100 predictions that have been made by different climate alarmists, by different environmentalists about the destruction of the earth, none of which, not a single one, has come true. And pretty soon you have to say, if they keep getting them wrong time and time and again, maybe you shouldn't trust what they're saying or count them as so-called experts.
Yeah. Well, let me just say that you can answer that question for yourself, that what is the one indisputable fact that best wins the argument, by getting our new book, Climate at a Glance, second edition. 40 facts on prominent climate topics. You can select your favorite out of 40 facts that counter climate alarmism, from CO2 saturation to the supposed destruction of the Great Barrier Reef to ice melt on both poles, extreme weather, you name it. The facts are there to give you the ammunition you need to fight back at the climate, not fight back, just have a conversation, a nice, pleasant one over the holidays with your friends and family, and to tell them the truth about what's happening with the climate. All right.
And Jim,
Jim. And if you order now, you get a free Climate Denier Club badge to go with it.
Don't say that. There are no Climate Denier Club badges. But, Jim, it's not enough that they buy it. Let's have them buy it and leave a review.
That's right. We need important. We need purchased reviews at Amazon.com for this book. It was already in its first week of release. It was number 1 in the category of climatology. It was number 1 in the category of earth sciences. But we can do better than that. We can move it around even more. So if you love this program, if you love what we do here, please go there. It's only this discounted already, $14.23. But it's about $15. Not a big deal, but it's a great little handbook, to be honest. It really is a great handbook to have to give you the facts you need on the climate. But all right, well, that will do it for today's show. We've gone on a little long. It didn't feel long. It didn't feel long at all because we had such a good time and we had such a great guest. The one and only Dr. Will Happer, PhD from Princeton University. Thank you so much, Will, for being on with us to talk about the Joe Rogan Experience in your experience and to take questions from our audience. And again, congratulations on that wonderful media coup for being on his program. I want to thank our streaming partners, junkscience.com, CFAC, the CO2 Coalition, which Will Happer is affiliated with, Climate Depot, what's up with that, Heartland UK, Europe. Thank you always, Anthony Watts, for being here on the show every week. And Sterling Burnett as well, always on this show. Again, go to climaterealism.com, go to climateataglance.com, go to amazon.com to get your Climate at a Glance new second edition. And always go to heartland.org where you could subscribe to Sterling Burnett's very own Climate Change Weekly newsletter so you get some great content in your inbox every single week. We will talk to you again next Friday. Bye-bye.
How dare you!